It's been a few weeks since my wife and I decided to open our marriage. At first glance, nothing had changed. We still had dinner together, discussed everyday affairs, and laughed at our son's jokes. But there was a new shade in the air, a shade of freedom that made my head spin at first. At first, I felt as if I had let myself out of a prison cell that I had been in for many years. The world outside her walls turned out to be bright, inviting, full of possibilities. I began to notice how women looked at me in cafes, in the gym, even in the office. These views, which did not matter before, are now filled with a new meaning. I was no longer bound by the rigid framework of marriage. I was free. One evening, when my wife left for her first meeting, she called it that, avoiding more specific words, I stayed at home, trying not to think about what she was doing. To distract myself, I decided to leave the house. I went to a bar I hadn't visited in a long time. The place turned out to be half empty, so I sat down at the counter and ordered myself a whiskey. My head was spinning with thoughts about my wife, about our decision, that we had started building something new, but we didn't know what it would lead to. After a while, a woman came up to the counter. Her figure was slender, her movements confident, and her gaze tenacious. She shot a quick glance in my direction, and I noticed a slight smile on her lips. Her confidence and elusive mystery attracted me, and I felt a strange excitement that I had not felt for a long time. A lonely evening? Her voice was unexpectedly soft and enveloping. It looks like it, I replied, feeling the alcohol slightly warm up my body and weaken my internal barriers. I'm bored too, she said, sitting down in the next chair. Maybe we should keep each other company? I nodded, and our conversation started as if we were old friends. Her name was Laura, and she turned out to be an interesting conversationalist, but I felt that there was something more behind her words, something that she wasn't ready to reveal yet. There was that sparkle in her eyes that people have when they are looking for something new, something that can turn their lives around. A few glasses later, when the atmosphere in the bar became more relaxed, Laura suggested a walk. We went outside, and the night air felt pleasantly cool on our skin. She walked beside me, her hand sometimes touched mine, and this touch sent goosebumps through my body. We reached her car, and she turned to me and offered to continue the evening at her house. I knew what this could lead to, and I understood that this would be the first step into a new, unknown world. I accepted her offer, and we went to her place. Her apartment turned out to be cozy, with soft lights and warm tones. Laura offered me a drink, but I refused. My head was already a little dizzy. She smiled and came closer, her movements smooth and confident. I felt my insides tighten when she touched my hand and then her lips. We ended up in her bedroom, and at that moment I was completely immersed in the sensations. Laura was gentle, but there was passion in her touch. For a moment, I forgot about everything about my wife, about our agreement, about the world outside this room. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt for a long time, but deep down inside, something continued to gnaw at me from the inside. In the morning, I woke up in her bed, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Laura was still asleep, her breathing was even and calm. I got up quietly, got dressed and left the apartment, trying not to wake her up. When I found myself outside, the morning air refreshed my thoughts, but the inner feeling of anxiety did not let go. Returning home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. On the one hand, I experienced something new, something exciting, but on the other hand, there was an emptiness inside. It was like a breath of fresh air, followed by a suffocating sense of guilt. When I opened the door of our house, I immediately felt that something had changed. His wife was sitting in the kitchen, her face tense and her eyes tired. I realized that she had also returned recently, and perhaps she had also spent the night away from home. But we were silent, avoiding discussing what had happened. This silence was like a chasm that grew bigger and bigger between us. I spent the next few days thinking. I went to meetings with Laura more and more often, trying to forget myself in her company, but each time after that I felt only a growing emptiness. My wife also began to spend less and less time at home, and I did not ask unnecessary questions, although everything inside was bursting with curiosity and jealousy. One evening, when I returned home, she was gone. I went into the bedroom and saw the ring she had left on the nightstand. It was there, like a reminder of what we had lost a long time ago. I took it in my hand, and at that moment it dawned on me that this experiment we were both involved in was starting to destroy us from the inside out. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the ring, and something inside me broke. Freedom, which seemed so tempting, turned into the bitterness of loneliness. I thought about the fact that my wife was probably spending time with someone else, and this caused a new surge of jealousy in me. But what could I say? We both agreed to this path, and now every step led us to even greater alienation. The next day I met with Laura, but this time something was wrong. She felt it too. Our conversations became strained, and our touches became mechanical. I tried to bring back that feeling of freedom and lightness that I had in the beginning, but it disappeared. Laura noticed it first. "You've changed," she said one day, looking at me suspiciously. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head, not knowing how to explain it. I wanted to leave her, but I didn't know how to tell her about it. Our meetings became rare, and then stopped altogether. Laura left as suddenly as she appeared, leaving behind only memories and a feeling of emptiness. I went back to my old life, but nothing was the same anymore. My wife became even more distant, her meetings continued, and I no longer tried to find out who she was spending her time with. We became like two strangers living under the same roof. Our freedom turned out to be a prison from which there was no way out. And although we still maintained the semblance of a family for the sake of my son, every evening when I returned home, I felt like something inside me was collapsing. The freedom we were looking for turned into an illusion, which hid the bitterness of loneliness. But I couldn't just give up. Deep down, I started hatching a plan. This plan was supposed to protect me and my son from the devastating consequences of our decisions. I understood that there was no turning back, and the only way out was to go forward, no matter how difficult it was. After that night with Laura, everything changed. I returned home, but now the feeling of emptiness and alienation has become unbearable. His wife was in the kitchen as usual, but this time her face looked even more tired and tense. We still avoided talking about what was going on in our lives. There was a silence between us that destroyed all remnants of intimacy. The next day, I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept coming back to what had happened. I couldn't get the image of Laura out of my head, but at the same time I was haunted by the thought that my wife might have been with someone else too. Jealousy and fear mixed with guilt, and I didn't know how to deal with these emotions. When I returned home, my wife was sitting at the table with her head down. Her fingers were nervously playing with a ring on the nightstand, which she had taken off the day our lives began to crumble. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but determined. I sat down across from him, feeling my insides tighten. She looked up, and I saw in them the pain she was trying to hide. "How did we get to this? What is it?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "When did everything go wrong?" The question was rhetorical, but it hit me like lightning. I also wondered this question, but could not find an answer. It all started so well. We were young, full of hope and love. Our days were filled with laughter, our nights with passion. But time has changed us, and over the years, it seems, there were fewer and fewer things that connected us. "I do not know," I answered honestly, meeting her gaze. "Maybe we just lost each other." She nodded, and sadness flashed in her eyes. "I've been thinking about it for a long time," she continued, avoiding my gaze. "About what we have to do to fix it. And the only thing that comes to my mind is to give each other freedom." These words made me tense up. I knew where she was going. We have already discussed the possibility of an open marriage, but then it was more a theory than a reality. Now that we have both begun to act within the framework of this agreement, it has become obvious that this is far from salvation. "Do you think this is the solution?" I asked, trying to hide my inner tension. "I'm not sure," she replied, looking at the ring in her hands. "But maybe it's the only way to keep what we have. If we give each other the opportunity to seek happiness on the side, maybe it will help us find ourselves." I didn't know what to say. This time her words did not sound like a request, but as a statement of fact. We have already started this journey, and now it seems there is no turning back. "We can try," I finally said, realizing that any other solution would lead to even more destruction. "But we have to have rules. We can't just let things take their course." She nodded in agreement. "I know. We've already discussed this. No close friends, no dates at home, no discussion of our relationship with others. We will be careful that it doesn't hurt our son." The words seemed right, but everything inside me protested against the idea. However, I understood that perhaps this was really the only way to keep the family together, even if it meant that we would become strangers to each other. "Okay," I replied, feeling anxiety building in my chest. "Then let's try." She put the ring on the bedside table, as if giving it to fate. We sat in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts, realizing that we had taken a step on a path from which there is no return. Our lives had changed, and now we could only hope that it would not lead us to complete destruction. We slept in the same bed that night, but now it was just a formality. I lay in the dark, listening to her even breathing, and thought about how we got to this point. The memories of a former life, when everything was simple and clear, now seemed distant and intangible. We were looking for freedom, but we found only a gap that separated us more and more. The next day we went back to our usual business, trying not to think about what was going on. But something new began to emerge inside me, the understanding that our lives would never be the same again. Now we had a long way to go to something unknown, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. It's been a few months since my wife and I started our experiment with open marriage. Life went on, but I felt like everything that had seemed familiar and reliable to me was gradually crumbling. I continued to go to work and meet with Laura, but there was a growing feeling of emptiness inside that nothing could fill. Every day I felt more and more how this emptiness alienated me not only from my wife, but also from myself. Outwardly, everything looked calm. Our son, Nick, continued to please us with his success at school, my wife continued to do household chores, and I regularly performed my duties at work. But underneath that appearance, there was something much darker and more destructive. One evening, when I returned home, I was greeted by an oppressive silence. My wife was not there, and I realized that she was back at her meeting. I took off my jacket, casually threw it on the back of a chair and headed to the kitchen, where a semi-finished product was waiting for me in the refrigerator, which I heated in the microwave. Everything happened mechanically, thoughtlessly, as if I was not in my body, but watching myself from the side. While I was eating, my mind wandered. I remembered the passion that once connected my wife and me, the intimacy that we shared. Now there is no trace of her. We lived together, but we were so far apart that it seemed as if we were separated by kilometers, and not by the walls of our house. After dinner, I decided to go for a walk. It was unbearable to stay in an empty house. I went outside and headed towards the park. The night was warm, and the fresh air burned my skin slightly. As I passed by people, I noticed their smiles, heard their laughter, but inside everything shrank from loneliness. There was a lot of life around, but I felt cut off from it. I found an empty bench and sat down, lost in my thoughts. There was no clarity in my head, just a mess. Everything that had been happening in recent months seemed like some kind of ridiculous dream from which I could not wake up. I was tormented by the thought that I had lost not only my wife, but also myself. Suddenly, I felt like I couldn't sit still anymore. Something had to change. The next day, I decided to take a day off and leave the city. I wanted to be alone, away from everything that reminded me of my failure. I told my wife that I was going to a business meeting, and she nodded without asking any questions. It was like our new relationship. We lived avoiding each other, as if afraid that any extra word would destroy the remnants of our family. I chose a small village in the mountains, where my wife and I used to spend weekends. At that time, this place was a symbol of peace and happiness for us, but now I hoped that it would help me find answers to the questions that tormented me. On the way, I stopped at a roadside cafe. The interior was empty, except for an elderly man at the counter looking out the window, as if waiting for someone. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the raindrops that began to fall from the gray sky. I didn't expect to see anyone I knew here, but when the door opened and Laura entered the cafe, I felt everything tense inside. She looked around, noticed me, and came over to my table. I didn't know if I was glad to see her, or if it would make my condition worse. "Hi," she said, sitting down across from him. "I didn't expect to meet you here." "Me too," I replied, trying to hide my confusion. "I decided to take a little break from the city." She nodded, her eyes tired, but there was still that confidence in them that had once attracted me so much. "Are you okay?" "What is it?" she asked, cocking her head to the side. This question made me think. I was far from okay, but I didn't want to admit it. Laura seemed to read my mind. "You know, sometimes I think we're all just running from something, but no one knows what it is," she continued, looking down at her cup. "Maybe," I said, feeling her words hit home. "But you can't run away from yourself." Laura looked at me with understanding, and at that moment I realized that she also felt the same way as me. Everything that seemed interesting and exciting to us in the beginning now looked empty and meaningless. Why did we decide that an open marriage would help us? I suddenly asked, not expecting such a revelation from myself. Laura thought about it, her fingers sliding along the edge of the cup. I think we were all looking for something new, something that would give us back the sense of life that we had lost, she said quietly. But instead we lost even more. I was silent, realizing how true her words were. Everything I was looking for seemed to be out of reach. Now that I saw Laura in front of me, I realized that our relationship was also not something that could fill the void that had formed inside me. Laura, I began, looking at her seriously, I can't go on like this. I need to change something. She nodded, her face sad, but there was no resentment or reproach in her eyes. I understand, she said softly. Maybe we both need something else. We sat in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. Then Laura got up, came over to me and lightly touched my arm. Take care of yourself, she said and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stayed in the cafe for a few more minutes, and then I decided to leave too. My trip to the village has lost its meaning. Returning home, I felt even more lonely than before. Everything I was trying to find turned out to be just an illusion, and now I needed to figure out how to live on. When I got home, my wife was sitting on the couch with a book in her hands. She looked up, saw me, and, without saying a word, plunged back into her reading. I went into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, feeling my stomach clench with despair. Our lives have turned into a series of empty actions, devoid of meaning and emotion. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. I was lying in bed listening to the silence of the house and thinking about how we got to this point. The memories of a former life, when everything was simple and clear, now seemed distant and intangible. We were looking for freedom, but we found only loneliness in the crowd. The next day, I decided to talk to my wife. I knew it could change everything, but I couldn't live in this state anymore. In the evening, when Nick went to his friends, I went up to her. We need to talk, I began, feeling my insides tighten with tension. She looked up from her book, her face was calm, but I saw something new in her gaze, something that made me tense up. About what? She asked, putting the book aside. About us, I replied, struggling to find the words. About how we live. She was silent, but I could see that she understood what I was talking about. We've become strangers, I said, trying to express everything that had accumulated over the months. I can't do this anymore. We wanted freedom, but it's not what I expected. We lost each other, and I do not know how to get it back. My wife was looking at me, her eyes were shining, but no tears were flowing. She was silent for a long time, then said softly, I know. I feel the same way. But what can we do? We have already made this decision. There is no return. I knew she was right. We had gone too far, and now we could only move forward, trying to find some way out. But deep down, I knew that our paths had already parted, and no amount of talking could bring back what we had lost. We sat in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts, realizing that our lives had changed forever. Perhaps we had to find a new path, but now we were too tired to look for it. We could only hope that time would give us the answers we were so desperately looking for. A strong wind was raging outside, driving dry leaves along the sidewalks as if playing some kind of cruel game. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of old floorboards. Everything seemed particularly depressing that evening. My son was visiting friends, and we found ourselves alone again in an empty house that had once been filled with life and laughter. My wife was sitting across from me, her face tense, her gaze thoughtful. She was holding a cup of cold tea in her hands, but she didn't seem to notice it. I was silent too, gathering my thoughts. Finally, I couldn't stand it and started a conversation. We can't do this anymore, I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling. We both know that. She didn't answer, but I saw her hands tighten on the cup. Over these months, despite all our efforts, something has changed irreversibly. The gap between us had only widened, and now it seemed impossible to bridge it. You're right, she finally said without looking up. But what can we do? Her voice was low, almost lifeless. It wasn't the tone I knew before, when there was always confidence in her words. Now in front of me sat a woman who had lost not only herself, but also everything that was dear to her. I think we need to finish this," I said, feeling my insides tighten. An open marriage was a mistake. We both tried to find something new, but in the end we lost everything. She looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes. "Are you saying that we should break up?" I nodded, although everything inside me resisted this decision. But I knew it was the only way out. I don't want to destroy our family, but we need to find a way to move on. Perhaps separately. She put down her cup and looked at me with pain and sadness that were too obvious to ignore. "I do not know if I can live without you," she whispered, and her voice trembled. "Neither do I," I replied, feeling a heaviness building in my chest. "But we've already lost each other. We need to move on, otherwise we will completely destroy everything that we had." She was silent, but I could see that she realized the truth of my words. It was a decision she had tried to make herself, but couldn't find the strength to make it. I got up and went to the window, looking out at the hurricane that was raging outside the house. He was like the chaos that was going on inside of us. "I agree," she said suddenly, and her voice sounded firmer than before. "We have to finish this before it's too late." I turned around, meeting her gaze, and saw in her eyes the same despair that I felt myself. "Let's do it right then," I suggested, sitting down across from her. "We'll talk to Nick, explain everything to him. We'll try to make sure he doesn't get hurt. And then we'll just go our separate ways." She nodded, and at that moment I realized that our decision was inevitable. We both knew there was no other way. The next day, we gathered Nick in the living room and explained our decision to him. He listened to us with a serious face, without interrupting. I could see his eyes darting between us, but he didn't ask any questions. When we were done, he asked quietly, "Are you getting a divorce?" His voice was full of fear, but I tried to explain to him as gently as possible. "We don't want to hurt you, Nick. We just realized that we couldn't be happy together. But that doesn't mean we don't love you." He didn't answer, but I saw his eyes fill with tears. We hugged him, trying to let him know that he is still dear to both of us, no matter what happens. It took several weeks before we filed for divorce. These weeks have been the hardest in my life. We lived under the same roof, but every day separated us more and more. Every morning I woke up thinking that it would all be over soon, and this thought brought relief and pain at the same time. Finally, the day came when we signed the documents. I remember holding a pen over the papers, feeling its weight, as if it were not a pen, but a brand that puts an end to our history. My wife was standing next to me. Her face was stony, but I knew that the same storm was raging inside her as mine. When it was over, we left the courthouse and headed for the car. Nick stayed at home, not wanting to participate in this process. We were silent, not knowing what to say. At some point I stopped and turned to her. "We did everything we could," I said quietly, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Now we have a chance to start all over again, each in his own way." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the same pain that I felt myself. "Yes," she whispered. "I hope that we will find what we are looking for." We stood for a few moments, looking at each other like two people who were once close, but now found ourselves on different banks of a river that can no longer be crossed. Then she turned around and walked to the car. I watched her go, realizing that this was our last moment together, and perhaps the last time we saw each other in this light. When she left, I remained standing on the street, feeling like everything was empty inside. The wind died down, and there was a strange silence. I returned home, feeling the silence spreading through the rooms, like an old acquaintance who came to visit. But at that moment, when I sat down on the sofa and felt loneliness wash over me like a wave, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised, but I went to open it anyway. Laura was standing in the doorway, her face worried. "You won't believe what I found," she said, a twinkle of excitement in her eyes. "Laura, what are you doing here?" I asked, feeling my fatigue fade into the background. I couldn't help but tell you that. You should know." Her voice was strained. I let her in, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. Laura pulled some documents out of her bag and handed them to me. I quickly scanned the pages, and everything inside me turned upside down. It's impossible," I gasped, barely able to believe my eyes. "But it's true," Laura insisted. "I did an investigation, and everything came together. Your wife. She's been planning to get out of the marriage all this time and take everything she could with her. This open marriage was just a cover to prepare the documents and take all the property in his name. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Inside, everything began to boil with anger and despair. Everything my wife and I built turned out to be a lie. She used me to carry out her plan, and now I'm left with nothing. But looking at Laura, I realized that now I have the opportunity to change everything. I didn't know how to do it, but the survival instinct woke up inside me. I realized that I could no longer be a victim. This new life that I was about to start would not be what I imagined, but I still had a chance to restore justice. "Thank you, Laura," I said, meeting her gaze. "You helped me a lot. Now I know what to do." We both understood that this was not the end, but only the beginning of a new path. I didn't know where it would lead, but I was ready to go to the end. Determination flared up inside me, and I realized that this new life would not be at all what I expected, but it was even better. We were standing at the window, looking out at the night city, and I realized that now I was finally truly free.